Good evening and welcome to tonight's author talk with Dr. Megan Kate Nelson. I'm Jamie Stout, the Director of Membership for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. We are so honored that you continue to join us with this new adventure of digital programming. We can't thank you enough for all the support over the past few months, and just want you to know that you are helping to ensure that Mr. Lincoln's legacy lives on. We appreciate that. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Megan Kate Nelson to discuss her latest book, The Three-Cornered War, which takes a deeper look into the Civil War in the American West. Megan is an expert in history of American Civil War, the West, popular culture, and the 19th century. She's earned her BA in History and Literature from Harvard University and her Ph.D. in American Studies from the University of Iowa. The format tonight's a little different than we have had in the past few months. Megan will do a brief overview and slideshow about her book, and then she's going to be joined by our very own ALPLM Lincoln Historian, Dr. Christian McWhirter. After their discussion, we will have time for questions from the audience, so feel free to go ahead and type ththose in the Q&A box below. So as we get settled in, please help me welcome Megan, and we'll get started.
All right, well, thank you everyone for being here with us tonight, sharing your Wednesday evening with me and with the Three-Cornered War. I'd like to thank Jamie for the invitation to come and speak to you, and to Christian for being in conversation with me. This is great. And I also have to say, thank you to the foundation for hosting these virtual events, because for historians and authors who have books out right now, when the pandemic hit, nobody really knew what to do. And so it's been wonderful that institutions have really pivoted quickly and it seems to me, seamlessly to the virtual format. This is really fantastic. So thank you for having me. So tonight I am going to be talking about my new book that is out. It's not so new anymore, out in February. And I'm just going to give you an overview of it because I think this is a theater of the war that people don't know much about. But before I start, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you tonight from the traditional lands of the Wampanoag peoples. So the Three-Cornered War tells the story of the Civil War in the desert Southwest. So most of the action in the book takes place in New Mexico and Arizona, with some short scenes in West Texas and Southern California and Colorado. And again, this is a theater of the war. Most people, even people who really are into Civil War studies, like many of you, and even Civil War scholars don't really know much about or talk much about. And this is what actually first intrigued me about this topic. I was doing research for my previous book, Ruined Nation, and was doing just sort of broad sweep general Civil War history. And I found out about these battles that had been fought between Union and Confederate troops in New Mexico in 1862. And I was shocked. I grew up in Colorado. I had never heard about any of these battles. I had never heard that Colorado soldiers had played a very big role in helping to defend New Mexico territory, and thus the larger West, from a Confederate invasion. I had heard of Sand Creek, but I didn't know it was Union soldiers who had taken part in that massacre in Southern Colorado. And, and I think Christian will agree, and we can maybe talk about this later, whenever historians find something that really shocks them that they didn't know anything about before, especially in a period that they're studying and they're used to studying, that really gets you going. That's how you know you found a good research topic, because you want to know more. So the driving question of the Three-Cornered War really was sort of what was happening in the Southwest during this period, and why was it happening? So in the summer of 1861, the West was really up for grabs. And the real question there is, why would the Union and the Confederacy even care, right? Most of the population was focused in the East. Most of the big armies were coalescing in the East in the spring and summer of 1861. So why did they even consider any kind of fight over the West? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, both the Union and the Confederacy wanted to control the West's gold mines because, as I think we all know, wars are very expensive. And both the Union and the Confederacy were interested in trying to figure out how they were going to pay for this war effort. And the Confederacy in particular knew that they were sort of outmoneyed on that score. And so they wanted access to those gold mines in the California Sierras and then also in the Rocky Mountains, which had had several gold strikes leading right up to the Civil War. So that was one reason. The other reason was that both the Union and the Confederacy wanted control over Pacific ports. Already, since Lincoln had signed the blockade order in April of 1861, ships were on their way to block southern ports along the Atlantic and the Gulf. And so they were looking for an out. They were looking for some deep water ports where they could ship out their cotton. And San Diego and Los Angeles were perfect candidates for that. So as you can see from this map, the far western edge of the Confederacy in the summer of 1861 was El Paso. And standing between El Paso and California was New Mexico territory, which in this period sort of encapsulated both New Mexico and Arizona. So they thought, well, we can just march an army right through New Mexico territory, take Southern California. They didn't even really need to take the entire state, get access to those deep water ports, ship out the cotton, and again, fund their war effort. And then a third reason, and this is one that we don't really talk about a whole lot, was that both the Union and the Confederacy had visions of the future that involved the West. So for the Union, that vision of the future was about settling the entire country with free, mostly white, farmers, ranchers, and miners. So obviously the West, which was 40% of the nation's landmass at this point, was an integral part of that vision. For Confederates, this was the opposite, right? Their vision was an empire of slavery, expanding from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the Confederates also thought if they were able to defeat the Union and establish their own country, that then they would start moving south and they would expand that empire of slavery into Mexico and perhaps also the Caribbean. So clearly gaining a foothold in the West was important for the Confederates, and keeping control of the West was really vital for the Union at this point. So how did this all begin? Well, I've just given you a short outline here. I'm not going to talk about all of these movements in detail because there's a lot of action going on in a lot of different places across hundreds of miles involving multiple communities. But I just gave you the outline here so you could have a general sense of how all of this was playing out. So the first move was an invasion of New Mexico territory by a relatively small group of Confederate cavalry under John Robert Baylor, who I'll talk about a little bit later in the talk. Baylor was actually not supposed to invade New Mexico territory. He was supposed to take all the forts in West Texas and secure them and then wait in El Paso for reinforcements. But he had heard that Union troops were coalescing under ERS Canby along the Rio Grande to defend the territory in the larger West. And so he just went ahead without orders, crossed the border, took the town of Mesilla, forced the surrender of the Federal Army's southernmost installation, Fort Fillmore. And Mesilla is just right outside of Las Cruces, if any of you are familiar with that area. And on August 1st, this was all happening in late July, 1861. On August 1st, John Baylor sat down and created the Confederate Territory of Arizona, which you can see on this map, extending from West Texas all the way to the Colorado River and the border of California. And obviously, this version of Arizona looks very different from the version that we know today. The reason for that is that there were a lot of white secessionists who lived in this southern portion of what was New Mexico territory. They had sort of migrated westward, kind of straight across latitude lines, all the way through New Mexico territory. So Baylor figured that he had a good chance to then secure the rest of that whole segment of New Mexico territory. And he knew that he was being followed by a 3,000-man army under Henry Hopkins Sibley, who was a former US military officer who resigned his commission in 1861, in the spring of 1861, in order to join the Confederate Army. And Sibley basically figured, this was his pitch to Jefferson Davis, was that he would create an army of Texans, that they would march into New Mexico territory. They really only needed a pretty long wagon train, and that they would sustain themselves along the road to New Mexico and then up the Rio Grande. Sibley believed that Hispano-New Mexicans would join him in this fight because he thought they had only been in the country for a little more than 10 years, probably had reason to hate the federal government as much as Confederates did. And he also thought that he could form some alliances with Native groups. Neither of these things came to pass, which became a problem for him. Nonetheless, Sibley and his troops did make it to New Mexico by January of 1862. And they fought the Battle of Valverde against those Union troops under Canby, which is in central New Mexico. They won that battle, actually, and then they started moving north. They took Albuquerque, they took Santa Fe, and then they moved northeast to try to take Fort Union, which was a huge military installation that they really needed because they were running out of supplies. But they ran into some Colorado miners at Apache Canyon and Glorieta Pass in March of 1862. They actually did technically win the battle of Glorieta Pass, but the commander of the Union troops in that battle, John Slow, had sent about a third of the army kind of around the back, and they burned the Confederate wagon train in its entirety, 80 wagons, and all of the Confederate supplies. And one of the major arguments in the book is an environmental argument, which is that the high desert climate and ecosystem really shaped the way the war played out in this region. And this is one of the ways. Without a wagon train and without allies, any more allies on the ground, Sibley's army could not hope to sustain their campaign for the Union. So they started a very long retreat all the way back from Santa Fe to San Antonio, more than 1,000 miles in the spring and summer heat of 1862. While that was happening, a 2,000-man army was on its way from Los Angeles to the Rio Grande under the command of James Henry Carleton. This army had meant to arrive in time to help Canby push the Confederates out of New Mexico territory, but they had been delayed by a 6-week rainstorm and had not actually gotten on the road through the deserts of Southern California and Southern New Mexico territory until late spring and summer, again, of 1862. But they finally made it in August. Along the way, they had a battle with Chiricahua Apaches at Apache Pass in July of 1862, and this really shaped Carleton's whole view of the war once he got into New Mexico and took command of the Department of New Mexico from Canby. So from that moment on, Carleton really envisioned a Union army that would, they'd already kind of taken care of the Confederates, and they were there to garrison the region and to prevent any further Confederate invasions. But what he wanted to do was really wrest control of these lands away from Native peoples. And so beginning in the fall of 1862, Carleton launched several campaigns, 3 of them, one against the Mescalero Apache, one against the Chiricahua Apache, and one against the Navajo. Kit Carson led the campaigns against the Mescalero and the Navajo, and Joseph West led the campaign against the Chiricahua Apache. Kit Carson was much more successful than West was. West was never able to bring the Chiricahuas to battle or really fully defeat them. But Kit Carson, by making hard war on both Mescalero and Navajo communities, forced their surrender and their removal to a reservation in central New Mexico called Bosque Redondo. Bosque Redondo became a huge site of humanitarian crisis. The site was poorly chosen. The water was terrible, the land was terrible for growing crops, and Carleton had really misjudged this, and he was pretty much personally responsible, I think, for about a 25% mortality rate among Navajos and Mescalero Apaches at Bosque Redondo between 1863 and 1868. So the book moves from the summer of 61 to the summer of 1868, when Navajos were actually able to negotiate their way back to their homeland, and really takes you through all of these different kinds of conflicts with a lot of different kinds of communities across thousands of miles of high desert landscape. And so the challenge for me in thinking about how to write this book was, how am I going to convey all of that complexity and still give readers a really good sense of what was happening on the ground? And at the time, I had been reading, and I still do read, a lot of both literary fiction and not so literary fiction. And I was reading Game of Thrones and also watching it on TV. And if any of you are familiar with that show or that book, that book has hundreds of characters and takes place in all kinds of different places. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, how is George R.R. Martin doing this? How is he still kind of bringing me along and making it very clear where we are, but I'm also very invested in these individuals on the ground. And I figured out that he was using a literary technique called multi-perspective narrative. And for those of you who've read The Killer Angels, this is also what Shara used to great effect, right? It's a very compelling kind of narrative style. You get a lot of good details on the ground, but you're moving through time but from place to place. And it also creates a kind of sense of tension while also driving you forward. And so I thought, I'm going to experiment with this, which was pretty fun. It was a little bit of a challenge because my previous two books were really academic books and very thematically structured and argumentatively driven. And so it was really interesting to experiment with this new style. So I picked 9 people who I sort of call my protagonists, and readers of The Three-Cornered War will kind of follow along. Most of these protagonists have 2 to 3 chapters that are named after them. You're with them during that period and kind of moving with them across through space and through time. And then there are 3 chapters where multiple protagonists come together, and they are battle chapters. So Valverde, Glorieta, and then Sei, which is Canyon de Chelly, which was Kit Carson's major campaign against Navajos in the winter of 1864. So I'm just going to introduce you to all 9 people. I'm going to talk at a little more length about one of them who may be of interest to you, given your interest in Lincoln. So of course I knew I had to start with John Robert Baylor in the summer of 1861, ignoring all orders this is very much a part of his character. He was very ambitious, very spontaneous, easily bored, and prone to great violence. And this really shaped all of his actions during his time in New Mexico. So the book begins with him and stays with him for a little bit. Juanita is a Navajo civilian. She was married to Manuelito, one of the most prominent headmen of the Navajo people, and a target of the Union Army. And through Juanita, we get a real sense of the experience of the Navajo people during this period on the ground, also the civilian experience, and also a greater sense of the importance of women in Navajo culture, in their economy. As you can see here, she is photographed among a group of weavings in a dress that she did in fact weave herself. She was known as a great weaver even as a teenager, and this was part of the Navajo economy, and it allowed me to talk about material culture, which was really, really cool, and textiles as part of the book. Here's James Henry Carleton, the Union commander who marched his men from California and then took control of the Department of New Mexico. He, of course, began a campaign against the Chiricahua Apache. Mangus Coloradus, who was one of the war chiefs in that particular tribe, is one of the protagonists. And the reason that I do not have a photograph of him is that even though he was one of the most prominent people in the Southwest, he was very well known. He was 70 years old by the time the war started. But he never sat for a photographer. Very few surveyors or anyone who had kind of illustrators with them stopped to create an illustration of him that was not a racist caricature. And so we actually don't know what he looks like. And a lot of historians have used a picture of his son, also named Mangus, to stand in for him, which has created a lot of confusion. So he unfortunately is the only protagonist in the book with no photograph for readers to see. But he was very striking physically. He was 6'4". He was very commanding. And again, he lived into his 70s during this period, which is really kind of amazing. But readers will get to know him and the various kinds of strategies that he used in relation to the US Army, which included warfare, but also included diplomacy. Alonzo Ickes was one of the first protagonists I picked out. I read his diary way back in 2010 when I was first thinking about this project in the Denver Public Library. He was originally from Iowa, but he went to Colorado during the gold rush of '59. And so he was in Colorado with nothing to do before a winter of, inactivity when the call for Union troops came out to go and defend New Mexico territory. So readers will follow him as he marches from Colorado down into New Mexico, fights the Battle of Valverde, and then kind of garrisons various forts in New Mexico before misbehaving with his company and getting kicked out of New Mexico territory by James Henry Carleton. Louisa Colby gives us another civilian viewpoint of the war. She was married to E.R.S. Colby, who was in command of the Department of New Mexico at the beginning of the war. She was what we would think of as an army wife. She had married Colby in the 1830s and then had traveled with him for more than 20 years to all of his postings, almost all of his postings, during his time in the Army. So she was in Santa Fe when the war began. She stayed there. She refused to kind of withdraw and flee from the city as the Confederates were coming. So she's there in the occupied city. She was also there after the Battle of Glorieta. And the reason I ran into her is that she is very famous among Confederate Texans. They called her the Angel of Santa Fe because she organized the nursing effort of Confederate soldiers after the Battle of Glorieta. One of those soldiers she nursed was Bill Davidson, who was a Confederate soldier from outside Houston. He joined up and was part of Sibley's brigade. So you kind of see a detailed his detailed experiences of being on those long marches from San Antonio into New Mexico, all the way up to Glorieta and all the way back again. And you'll be there with Bill Davidson, who wrote a series of accounts of his wartime action and is kind of a character. He had a really good sense of humor, and so he really kind of comes alive on the page for you. Probably the most famous person in the book who you have heard of is Kit Carson, but most Americans, I think, really associate Kit Carson really with the Fremont expedition and being a kind of Indian fighter or a dime novel hero. I don't really think of him as a Union soldier, but he was an officer. He was in command of the New Mexico troops, particularly the 1st New Mexico, which was his regiment, and they fought in the Battle of Valverde. And then he, of course, went on to lead the campaigns against Mescalero Apache and Navajo peoples. And finally, the 9th protagonist, John Clark, I'm going to talk a little bit more about in detail because he was a friend of Lincoln's. So Clark was born in New York, but his family moved to Michigan when he was quite young. His father had been a physician, but then kind of got the bug to go west and became a surveyor for the General Land Office. So Clark followed in his footsteps, started surveying also when he was quite young in Michigan, and then moved to Illinois. He helped to found and then lay out the city of Freeport and got married there, settled his family there. And he was one of these guys, he's one of these 19th century guys who just had a lot of different jobs. So he was a surveyor, but then he was, county clerk. He read the law and passed the bar. And this is actually how he met Lincoln, was on the lawyering circuit. They didn't spend a lot of time together, but they did know each other. By the time the war came around, he was 47 years old, though. He was a little too old to shoulder a rifle to support the Union, but he was a devoted Republican. And the Illinois Republican Party put his name forward actually to be the Surveyor General of Utah, which was a kind of primo post because it meant living in Salt Lake City, which was very interesting to many people in the 19th century because of its Mormon establishment. But instead, Lincoln appointed him to be the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. So he went in September and October. He left his family in Freeport and went to report to Santa Fe. And when I ran into John Clark, who I don't think many people have ever heard of, I ran into him because the Chavez Library at the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe has all of his diaries, and there are 25 volumes. And you can see from this upper left photograph, these are just 3 of his diaries. So they're in all different shapes and forms, but they are all in really amazingly good shape. He wrote very detailed entries of all of his time in Santa Fe. He did take furloughs and he went home and he visited his family, went to DC a couple of times. But for all the time he spent in Santa Fe, he wrote these amazing entries about the weather, about social life, about dinner parties he went to and votes. And then also the kind of work that he was doing, surveying, for farming, for ranching, for mining. He also surveyed Bosque Redondo before Carleton initiated all of his kind of war and removal plans. So when I read through these, at first I thought that Clark was just going to provide me with a lot of good kind of colorful background detail for Santa Fe. But then I just, after reading his diary, I was like, he was really important. He played a very important role in shaping and connecting kind of Republican ideals and images of the West in Washington, D.C. to the reality on the ground in New Mexico territory. The surveys that he did and the reports that he sent really shaped expectations in Washington for what the West was going to be. And in fact, the photograph in the lower left shows you the box of Clark's correspondence with the General Land Office. So he wrote on a very regular basis, and I was able to find all of those letters that he wrote. And they are also in pristine condition. And so I was able to see all of his words and then a lot of his survey maps. And then his diaries include kind of charming things like this that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, little sketches and maps that he made kind of along the way that he then used later to create more professional types of maps. So along with Juanita, John Clark is the protagonist who is in the book from beginning to end, from 1861 to 1868. And I think readers will really be surprised about how big of a role he played, how important the role of Surveyor General was in not only New Mexico, but in all the Western territories, and how that kind of civil position actually helped to shape wartime aims in the Civil War West. So ultimately, what do we learn when we look at the Civil War from this new vantage point, from this really unexpected place of the Southwestern desert? Well, I think we learn a couple of things. As the title of my book suggests, I think we learned that the Civil War was not just about the North and the South, that it was in fact a three-cornered war in a couple of different ways. It was a war that involved the North, the South, and the West. It involved Union, Confederate, and Native fighting forces. And those battles were fought by Anglo, Hispano, and Native soldiers. So this is a really interesting place to kind of look at race and ethnicity. I think it tells us the really hard truth, which is hard to wrap your mind around and very upsetting if you're kind of used to thinking about the Union and its just cause. Because what you realize when you look at the Southwest is that while the Union Army was fighting for emancipation in the East, they were fighting for Native extermination and removal in the West. And that Republicans and white Northerners did not see those two goals as oppositional. They did not see them as contradictory. They saw them as all part of this larger vision that I was talking about in the beginning of a free white nation of ranchers and farmers and miners. And it really shows us then, I think, with all of these different aspects, that the Civil War was really a continental conflict, that it took place from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that it was fought and experienced by a range of different communities across the nation, including in the American West. So I will stop there, and Christian and I can have our conversation. Because I'm eager to know what he thought about the book. I know that he has recently read it, and I respect his opinion as a historian of the war. So I'm excited for his questions and for all of your questions as well.
Oh, sure. How awkward if I didn't like it. No,
I know. You'd be like, well.
I don't know, Megan. Yeah, it was kind of a snoozer. Now, no, I really adored this book. And I really mean that. And I don't want to. We're getting a lot of really good questions, so I would love to just chat with you for this whole time, and I'll try not to hog you to myself. But yeah, I mean, my just kind of broad reaction. I read. This might say more about my Civil War blind spots than anything else, but I think the only real treatment I'd ever read before was, bits and pieces of this in other things. I remember reading in my really early Civil War days, I think Shelby Foote talks about Glorietta Pass, and so I remember reading that in Foote.
Yeah.
Although it's definitely the two. It's it's not a three-cornered situation. It's it's
Right.
more about Sibley and his supplies and so I mean I really want to emphasize for everyone before I ask any questions, how readable this book was and how it took a subject that I knew a little bit about, and the Civil War Far West is very is a bit of a complicated story. So you really with the narrative technique you chose really works well in this book, and the book, besides being interesting, which you always want in a history book, but it reads really well too. I when Megan said I recently read it, I was just on vacation. I just got back from being in a cabin in the woods, and I read most of this book sitting on the deck of that cabin, and it was it was a pleasure to read it. So I really want to first of all just endorse the book to everyone for how readable it is, and how much I enjoyed it and how much I learned from it. As someone who studies the Civil War for a living, I learned a lot from this book. This wasn't one where I could I can skip this chapter because I already know this story. That never happened with this book. So
that's good. That's great to hear, because those were my twin goal. My twin goals for the book are that people will come away from it feeling like they learned something new and feeling like it was a good read. So the fact that you had both of those experiences makes me very happy.
Well, good. Yeah, that definitely was my experience, and I think it will be for anyone else too. So yeah, if any of this sounds interesting at all to you, yeah, please grab the book. You answered a few. I had a few questions I was going to ask, and you got to a few of them in your presentation. You talked about though the context that it adds, that the Native American experience adds to our understanding of the war. And I was going to ask you about how that reshapes our view of the Union. It struck me too that I thought, and I'd like you to expand upon this a little bit, and then I'll get to another thing. The way that the Union guys, especially Clark and Carleton and Carson, you talked about how they didn't see their twin goals of emancipation and Native American conquest as oppositional, but you try to nuance them, and I think you successfully do it, and you can tell me if I'm reading this wrong. I want your thoughts on they didn't think they were doing the wrong thing for these people. Like they seemed to they weren't Indian haters, so to speak. They were, to use the old term, they were just misguided in their racism. I'm trying to thread this needle here. Can you get a little bit into what's motivating these guys to do the things they're doing besides just naked conquest? What's going through their heads?
Yeah, I mean, of course, they're all complicated and they all have a different viewpoint, right? Carleton actually started out thinking he was going to make alliances with all Native groups in the region. And in fact, as he was coming eastward, he did make an alliance and a kind of trade compact with the Pima and Maricopa peoples who lived along the road outside of Tucson, because they had the only agricultural fields. So they became kind of the Union Army's quartermasters in this region, which was really interesting. And they never had any violent conflict. They had a perfectly amiable meeting. So he did have the capacity to think about Native peoples as allies in that sense. But when he moved through Apache Pass and he saw the kind of remnants and ruins of the battle that happened there, he became really enraged. And he became convinced that, which was true, that the Chiricahua Apache and the Navajo people and the Mescalero people were never going to surrender to the Union Army or the federal government just because. And so he started to develop this kind of policy that they would not make treaties anymore. First, they would make war, and the point of the war, even though he did call it a war of extermination, and he did give orders to Carson and West to kill everybody if they needed to, what he really wanted was to force them to surrender so that he could remove them to Bosque Redondo and to other reservations. And Carleton was very religious, and he saw this kind of through the Christian lens, where he wanted to civilize them. He wanted them to learn English. He wanted them to convert to Christianity. He wanted them to become farmers. And this was a very common, idea among white Americans everywhere, not just Northerners, but Southerners also. That this was the goal they had in mind for all. It
had been for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. And Kit Carson had a kind of different view. He had been married to 2 Native women before. He had been an Indian agent to Utes. His first New Mexico was the most diverse army in the entire Civil War, with Hispano volunteers and then also Pueblo and Ute scouts. And several Native tribes in the area kind of saw him as an ally. But he was following orders. He was in the Union Army, and he had a very long track record of war against Native peoples, and he knew exactly what to do. And he was the one who initiated the hard war strategy against particularly Navajo people, starting in the summer and the fall of 1863, and then really pushing it into the winter of 1864. So when push came to shove, even though I think Carson had a more nuanced view of Native people and really argued to the commissioners who came later that it was white people who were really pushing this. They were causing all the conflict. They were pushing against, they were moving into Native lands and provoking these conflicts. In the end, he led the campaigns and, led the first group of more than 200 Native people on the long walk to Bosque Redondo from the Navajo homeland. So, yes, they were all nuanced, and they did have kind of they had all different kind of, in minor ways, sensibilities about how Native people should be treated and then what Native people's future should be. But they all agreed, and this is, white Southerners also, they all agreed that what needed to happen is that Native people needed to be removed from their lands, and they needed to make way for white settlement.
And it's, you make a good point here too, that they all inevitably, they get to that same point where the conflict, kind of escalates and let me tell you one more thing before I go to these other questions too. You recently published an article in the Atlantic, again, talking about the nuanced legacy of these guys, also talking about the Confederates. Obviously there's a lot of discussion going on right now about Confederate monuments and Civil War monuments. And just like everything else about the Civil War, this context, this far West context has a role in that discussion. It does in this discussion about monuments as well. So if you could comment a little bit on some of that and what's been going on out there, what the kind of memory of the Civil War is out there and how it's commemorated. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So just to give everyone a sense of what's happening, if you don't know, about a month ago, when the monument protests were at their height, there was destruction of the Colorado Soldiers Monument in Denver. And then the city removed a monument of Kit Carson in order to kind of protect it from any kind of either removal by protesters or whatever they were going to do to it. And then in Santa Fe, and actually I'm going to share my screen with you again because I do have images of this. So this is the Soldiers Monument, the monument to Union soldiers, which is in Santa Fe Plaza. And readers of the book will actually see the beginnings of this monument because John Clark is one of the people who contributed money, and he was at the event where they laid the cornerstone of this obelisk. So this is a monument to Union soldiers, and it has kind of 4 faces on it. And it lauds, it says kind of to the heroes on 3 of the sides of who have fallen in various battles with the Confederates at Verde, at Glorieta, Apache Canyon, Peralta. And then on this third face, it says, to the heroes who have fallen in the various battles with, and until 1974, about that used to say savage Indians in the territory of New Mexico. In the 1970s, an American Indian movement activist came and chiseled that word out. And the city of Santa Fe decided to keep it. They erected a plaque sort of explaining about that language use. About a month ago, activists, most of them indigenous, but also members of the Black Lives Matter movement, had sent a letter to the mayor and said, we want this monument, and there's also a monument to Kit Carson, which looks very much like the Union soldiers monument, but is just off the plaza in front of the courthouse. They wanted these two monuments removed, and then a couple of other ones. And unlike in Colorado, so in Colorado, the governor kind of took a hard line and said, we're going to prosecute all the people who damaged these monuments, and we're going to rebuild the monument to Colorado soldiers. The mayor of Santa Fe took a different kind of tact. Right now, and I don't have current pictures here, but you can see that both of these monuments have been kind of tagged, and then also during an event, indigenous artists put their hands in red paint and put them on the monument's face. Right now, both of those monuments in Santa Fe are covered with placard, and they are taking commissions for artworks to be placed on all four sides of both of these obelisks. And they are encouraging indigenous artists and other artists of color to contribute artworks, so that these monuments, instead of kind of lauding these wartime actions against Native people, becomes a more kind of inclusive space in Santa Fe Plaza, which is really interesting and also kind of a remarkable move, because I don't think we've even seen this in many cities that are dealing with Confederate removal right now. I mean, I think protesters have taken control of like the Lee Monument and made it an artwork themselves, but I don't think we've actually seen much from local officials kind of taking this particular or engaging with this particular strategy, which I think is actually great. I mean, I've always advocated, since Charlottesville, I've been advocating for these monument sites to become artistic places and to be reimagined by artists today, to kind of to reflect more accurately, you know, our great diversity in this country. But yeah, I mean, Christian, had you heard of any of this happening kind of in Denver and in Santa Fe, or was this something sort of, because it was Union monuments, which is just seems, it's hard to wrap your head around it, right? And because it was the West, did it just seem like a kind of weird moment?
Well, I'm a bad example because I follow you on Twitter, so.
Okay. All right, but you know what was going on.
I may have already heard about it before you started tweeting about it, but I'm pretty sure I certainly would have heard about it from you. So, and if you're on Twitter, follow Megan. She's great. So.
Thank you.
But no, I didn't know these monuments existed, and again, and like I said, this might say more about me but I you know, I think it's a common experience. You know, it certainly wouldn't have occurred to me, you know, as you know, a little bit of my background is I lived in Alabama for 7 years because I went to grad school down there. So I was very, you know, and then I lived in Virginia for a while. So, and I do memory stuff, same as you do. So this idea of these monuments and commemoration was something I was very familiar with. I never had discussed, you know, anything west of Texas in that context. Yeah. So this was news to me, and it's definitely an interesting wrinkle on it, and the Native American context for the Civil War is one that often gets lost, and it's obviously an important context. I'll use that to segue into some of the questions we have from our viewers, and one of them is, you know, someone just asked you for just a quick overview of the kind of broader Native American context for the Civil War, the idea that certain tribes, you know, whether they allied with, you know, the Union or the Confederacy, and that kind of complicated thing. Obviously, that's a huge story, you know, so you don't need to, but, you know, if you could just give a kind of quick kind of sense of the overall role Native Americans played, and maybe how your story fits into that broader context.
Sure, yeah, just to yeah, I'll try to condense it all down.
Sorry.
So, yeah, no. It's a great question. And it's a really important one. More than 20,000 Native men served in both Union and Confederate armies. And we still don't have a ton of work about them. I mean, most of the attention has been on Indian Territory, because at this point in 1861, Indian Territory was, of course, divided up between 5 different tribes, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Chickasaw. And all of them were slave-owning, Black slave-owning Native tribes. And the Confederacy went hard after them and actually sent Albert Pike to go negotiate with them. His monument came down in DC very early in the conflict. And he recruited troops to the Cherokee Mounted Rifles. So he is the one who brought Stand-Watie and other soldiers into Arkansas to fight at the Battle of Pea Ridge. So there are Confederate troops who are Native, and then there are Natives serving in Union companies also from the upper Midwest, also in the East, but not in kind of large regiments like we saw at Pea Ridge on the Confederate side. And then, of course, in the Southwest and the West, men from many different tribal communities worked as scouts and spies for Union troops and sometimes Confederate troops, although that was not as common. And they were often exploiting Union Army presence, which really, really kind of elevated and increased during this period, which really changes the way the West looks. So I think what we need to, when we think about the kind of larger Native Civil War, and also there's a lot of good work, I should say, right now about to come out, being done currently on the Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota. So this was an uprising of the Dakota people against the Union Army in August and September of 1862. So this is happening around the same time that a lot of Carleton's campaigns are getting underway. And that conflict lasted for quite some time. And then, of course, Lincoln played a role in commuting the sentences of most of the Dakota men who had been arrested, I think around 400 of them, but he commuted the sentences of most of them. But there was a mass hanging in Mankato, Minnesota. And there is still a lot of controversy in the memory of that conflict. But so there's a lot of work being done on that conflict also right now. But we need a lot more work, because I think one of the I don't think there's any way you can say there was one Native Civil War experience, because tribes were so different, because all of them took they had different strategies for dealing with the federal government and with white settlers who were in their midst. Some of them were untouched by the Civil War at all and didn't engage with the Federal Army until much later, until the 1880s and 90s. So I think it would be fantastic if we had this sort of upswell of Native Civil War studies, because I think we would really learn a lot about the diversity of that experience, and then also the ways that Native people and also consideration of Native people shaped war policy.
Yeah, and you touched on a bunch of things there, and that the idea of the different you said the varied Native American experience, and the way different Native American tribes and groups try to negotiate the wars, being fought by first the colonies, and then these continental wars. That there's a long history of that, and them trying to navigate this situation. The Civil War is part of that longer history. You mentioned the Dakota War. Obviously, that's a very much a Lincoln story. Lincoln gets directly engaged at the end of that war. It's nevertheless still the largest mass execution in American history. One of our viewers asked about Lincoln's level of engagement in the conflicts that you described. Can you talk a little bit about how aware is Lincoln of what's going on? What's Lincoln's role in all this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Lincoln was aware of what was happening. He was, John Clark, in particular, was sending dispatches from New Mexico Territory about the civilian arm of this, about surveying. And then Carleton, who, and I should say, he was a great source for me to have because he was just a prolific writer. He wrote so many orders and reports, 10 or 15 a day, just was crazy. And so he was constantly sending missives back to the War Department, and they became part of reports that Lincoln undoubtedly heard about in cabinet meetings. In every one of his annual messages to Congress, Lincoln addressed the West in some way. Usually he was addressing the mining prospects. This is what Republicans were really interested in, especially after 1862, after the summer when they were able, the Confederates were finally out, and they had been defeated. They were already retreating in the spring. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that it was necessary for the Union Army in the West to expel the Confederates before the Confederate Congress passed the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act, and created the Department of Agriculture. They did all of this in the wake of the Union victory over Confederates in the West. And these were policies that Republicans have been trying to get passed, during all the 1850s, but they couldn't do it because of Southern resistance in Congress. And so once Lincoln was elected, and once the South seceded, they had the power in Congress to pass these, but they had to wait until they knew they had control over the West. So of course, Lincoln signs those. He talks about those in all of his annual messages and how they are going to, benefit the future of the West. He signed the order creating the reservation at Bosque Redondo. He definitely was kind of along the same lines as Carleton, someone who had, the kind of attitude toward Native peoples that they needed to be civilized, that they should be removed. And his kind of attitude toward Indian policy was changing near the end of his presidency. He was becoming more interested in thinking about Indian policy kind of more progressively before he was assassinated. So we'll never know kind of what plans he would have put into place. Although I think we do kind of know, because I think Grant implemented many of the same policies that Lincoln would have during his presidency. So we can talk about that later, but yeah, I mean, I would say Lincoln was aware. I would say he wasn't driving the policy. I think most of that was coming from the War Department, but he was definitely on board.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, some of those policies, the things Lincoln and really the Republicans in Congress that Lincoln's signing off on are doing, these are old Whig ideas. They're not even Republican ideas, right? I mean, these are things that carry over from the Whig Party. Yep. The idea of clearing out, Native American tribes to make way for, quote unquote progress is something Lincoln personally participated in the Black Hawk War.
Exactly.
These are old ideas of Lincoln's. It's interesting you bring up Lincoln's views are maybe changing near the end of his life. Obviously, that's happening with his views on African Americans as well. So there's a lot of parallels there. But I think you're ultimately right. I think he would have landed in a similar place to where Grant landed. Speaking of emancipation, somebody asked a direct question based on something you said, that you mentioned slavery and Native Americans, and that's a really interesting and kind of complex idea in the book. So can you talk a little bit about whether Native Americans owned slaves and what would and Native Americans as slaves and how complicated that is in this region?
Yeah, the history of slavery and enslavement and unfree labor in this region is very long and very complicated. And there are also some great books. Andres Resendez has a great book out called The Other Slavery, which details some of this. And what's interesting, and part of the reason that Sibley thought it was possible that Hispano-New Mexicans would go with the Confederacy, and there were 50,000 of them living in New Mexico Territory. So that's huge, right? So one of the reasons was that, they hadn't been Americans for very long, but another reason was that they had a system of enslavement that had been in place from Spanish colonial period onward. The Southwest had basically evolved into this very large regional economy in sheep and cattle and slaves. And so each community, Hispano communities and Native communities, would raid each other constantly. And they would raid each other for animals and for captives. And then they would trade those at rendezvous everywhere. And so there were Apache and Navajo slaves in Hispano households along the Rio Grande. And there were Hispano slaves and captives in Apache and Navajo communities. Sometimes they were integrated into those families. The system was not as stringent and not as kind of intensive as Black slavery in the South, but it existed. And there was a class of very wealthy Hispano landowners who were called ricos, and they controlled the government and the kind of territorial legislature in the 1850s. And they went so far as to pass a law allowing Black slavery, even though I think there were fewer than 100 Black men and women in New Mexico during this period. But they did pass a law about it. They then repealed it after 1861, but it was there. And so this is a real sticking point also when Carleton gets there, and especially after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, because once the Union Army sort of in place, and there are so many of them, I mean, this is one of the major developments, is that, you know, the Southwest really just had a kind of handful of forts that were garrisoned by maybe 300 troops each at the beginning of the war. And then suddenly it has 6,000 soldiers kind of concentrated along the Rio Grande after 1862. And so many Native men and women who had been enslaved and children kind of ran to the Union Army in ways that were kind of similar to the situation in Union occupied areas in the Eastern Theater. And Carleton in particular didn't really know what he should be doing. If he should be returning these people to these Hispano households, or in order to kind of still continue to secure Hispano alliance, or if he should actually free them and return them to their Native communities. There wasn't as much action the other way, with Hispano slaves kind of escaping from Native communities. But it took a long time, and actually one of the elements in the negotiation in the US Navajo Treaty in 1868 was about returning enslaved men and women from Hispano households to the Navajo homeland. And in fact, Congress had to pass something called the Peonage Act, specifically to just say, yes, the Emancipation Proclamation applies to New Mexico Territory too, because the Ricos kept trying to like find loopholes and get out of it. So that situation is very complicated, and it's an issue for the US Army and for Native and Hispanic communities during this entire period.
Well, and we're out of time, so I'll try to take too long with this stuff too. But yeah, you talked about kind of Confederate fantasies of what their empire would look like too, and so they're definitely imagining, you know, when people talk about, you know, and this is probably an old argument now, but you know, the idea that, you know, slavery was tied to the cotton trade and to agriculture, and that's one of the reasons it would have inevitably died out. No, these Confederate, they're imagining putting slaves in the mines, right? Using enslaved people in the mines out west, using them, you know, eventually they're thinking in industrial ways, but definitely there's a diversified version of African American slavery that they are envisioning as what they're going to do when they get a hold of California and these other places, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So it's another element of that story. It just never actually comes to pass. Well, we'll end on we got a question here to come back to the core. Last question is, I'm going to read this question exactly. Of your 9 protagonists, which stole your heart and which character stole your head, and why? Cute little question, yeah.
I think Juanita really stole my heart. I mean, and what's interesting about her story is that I had no kind of words from her directly. She left no written records, but what she did leave were stories that were told to her descendants. And I was super lucky that one of her descendants is a Navajo historian named Jennifer Nez Dannette Dale. And she has written extensively on Juanita and Manuelito. So I was able to use those sources that Dr. Danette Dale has published. And also, Navajo women have done a really wonderful job producing histories of women in the community, and then also oral histories of the Long Walk and the time at Bosque Redondo. So that was hugely useful in sort of building her story. And also, kind of like Louisa Canby, I was able to track her through her husband. Because the Union Army really wanted Manuelito, they were trying to figure out where he was the entire time. So because she was with him, I could track her. And again, she, along with Clark, was there from the beginning to the end. And I think her story is really one of real suffering, but also persistence and survival. And so in the end, it's kind of bittersweet, but it's also really affecting. And I think she really is kind of the heart of the book. And as for the candidates who kind of messed me up, I mean, there are a couple candidates for that one, right? I mean, John Baylor is probably one of the worst people ever in the 19th century. I mean,
one of my notes was, so Baylor's a jerk, isn't he?
Really, really the worst. Like his only real redeeming quality is that he really, really loved his wife. And he apparently wrote her love poetry, which I could not find in the archive, much to my disappointment, because I would have loved to see it. But that was really his only redeeming quality. Otherwise, he was just, vicious and violent and ambitious in the worst possible way, and just self-absorbed and just really, really terrible. And yet he kept getting these leadership positions.
Yeah.
And ends up in the Confederate Congress. And by the end of the war is still trying to convince Jefferson Davis to give him troops to go take New Mexico territory. He's like obsessed with it for the rest of the war. So I think he's, So most loved Juanita, most hated Baylor.
Yeah, I think I agree. Well, and I tried, well, I'll throw this out. I mean, Megan, you might know the answer, that I tried to figure out if Clark was at the Freeport debate, and I couldn't figure it out. So if any of you out there figure that out, shoot me an email and let me know, because I was trying to figure out if he was there or if he helped set that up or something. If he was
I wouldn't be surprised.
No, I wouldn't either.
And I don't have any records from that period, but they might have those records in Freeport.
Yeah, I wondered too if he was there, or all those Republican guys, he might have helped set it up or something. But
I think it's
anyway. This was really great, Megan. I don't mind saying one of the reasons I asked to host this was to get an opportunity to talk to you, because I respect your work and how much I enjoyed this book. So Megan's got a copy behind her there, but there's my copy too. So to get you a nice close look of it, folks. So please, everybody, if go pick up Megan's book, and follow Megan on Twitter, and I think Jamie's got all the places you can go to follow Megan's career. One of the most interesting historians working today. So thanks for coming on, Megan. I really enjoyed this.
I'm gonna put that on my business card now.
And
can I quote you on that? I'm gonna blurb you for that. No, that's great. Thank you so much for having me.
That's the deal, right? Yeah. No, I would have said it even if that wasn't true. So all right, well, but I know Jamie has a few things to say, so I'm gonna throw it to Jamie. But let me just say thanks again to Megan, and thanks to everyone out there for watching. And if you have any other questions for Megan too, Jamie will give you the contact information for that too, where you can reach out to her and find out stuff. So thank you again. I'll see you all next time.
Thank you guys so much for the discussion. Dr. Nelson, Dr. McWhirter, thank you again so much. I learned a lot considering all the questions that we received. I know the members also loved it as well. If we didn't get to your question tonight, I do encourage you to contact Megan via her website. It's megankatenelson.com. Also want to encourage everyone to buy Megan's book if you haven't already. We obviously encourage you to shop local, your local bookstore, or wherever books are sold. I personally enjoyed mine via Audible Books and loved it that way. So Again, if you enjoyed tonight's program, please encourage your friends and families to purchase a membership so they too can enjoy this type of content, or consider purchasing a membership for them as a gift. And as always, we thank you so much for supporting our mission of encouraging Lincoln scholarship. So please make a donation to ALPLM.org. And as we do close out the webinar tonight, there will be a short survey that pops up. It'll take you 60 seconds or less. It just helps us to continue to improve our programming. So again, thank you, Megan. Thank you, Kate, Megan, and Christian, sorry. And everyone have a good night. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.